Jim Wallis, and I'm with Sojourners here in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Richard Land, and I'm the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the public policy arm of Southern Baptists, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the country. Jim and I are going to talk about the budget, talk about the budget ceiling, the debt and the budget ceiling, and the budget crisis in Washington, and to some degree how that impacts the health care debate. I call it a crisis because we're borrowing 42 cents of every dollar that our federal government spends. I look upon that as a moral issue. It's generational theft. We're stealing our children and our grandchildren's future by that level of borrowing. It cannot be sustained. It will foreclose our children's economic prospects and our grandchildren's economic prospects. They'll spend most of their productive lives paying off our debts unless we get this debt monster under control and get federal spending under control, and do so quickly.
Well, I always enjoy talking with you, Richard, about these things, and we sometimes come at them from different places, but often find some common ground, and I hope we can on this too. I want to start by saying that a budget is a moral document, whether it be around a family table or in the halls of Congress. And I agree with you that a deficit, the amount of debt that we have, is a moral issue. I've got an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I don't want them to be saddled with terrible debt. I also think how you resolve, how you reduce deficit, how you do it is a moral issue too, on whose backs that burden falls. So I'm glad to be part of a broad effort now called the Circle of Protection. The Bishops' Catholic, the Catholic Congress is involved in this, the National Association of Evangelicals, Salvation Army, Sojourners, Bread for the World, many of us. And we're saying that spending on poor people is not what caused this deficit. That's not how it came about. And we don't think the burden should fall on the poorest and most vulnerable. So we want there to be a circle of protection from the faith community around the poorest and most vulnerable. Because as you know, Richard, the debts and budgets, these are moral choices we're making.
Well, they are. But I have to take issue, Jim, with one thing you said. You said that the poor are not the reason for this deficit. They're one of the major reasons for it. We paid last year $700 billion in federal money in means-tested welfare and aid programs, mostly as a result of single parenthood. Single parenthood is the largest cause of poverty in the United States. Children who grow up with two parents have enormous advantages in our culture, and unfortunately, they are now a minority. That's a moral issue. We have allowed fathers to walk away from their responsibilities to the children they've sired and the mothers they've married or the mothers they've cohabited with without much penalty. We need to talk about getting rid of no-fault divorce for starters. That would help. And we need to talk about
Richard. You and I are both for marriage.
But
marriage.
But it's a moral and an economic issue, Jim. $700 billion a year in means-tested welfare services, mainly to replace absent fathers and what they would provide for their families.
Well, I don't think those numbers are correct. This deficit
trust me, they are.
This deficit was caused by financing two wars off the books. Two wars.
Well, that's not true. That's not true, Jim.
$120 billion a year in Afghanistan.
That's not true, Jim.
And the tax cuts for the wealthy. Half the deficit is because of tax cuts for the wealthy and two wars financed off the books.
The budget deficit, Jim, has increased by over 4% since Mr. Obama took office. It took us from George Washington through George Bush to get the national debt we have, and it will double in 8 years under Obama's spending. It's Obama's spending that has sent us over the edge.
Richard, that's just a partisan statement. The budget, we had a surplus under Bill Clinton, a surplus. When George Bush came in, we had a surplus. And when George Bush financed 2 wars off the books and gave tax cuts to the wealthiest people in the country, that's half our deficit. Well, and Obama has come in, it has increased under Obama.
Dramatically.
It's been Bush and Obama. I'm just saying, let's put everything on the table. Military spending, revenues, entitlements, all that. I'm saying who should not be on the table is the poorest and most vulnerable. That we've added those numbers up too. It's no more than 20% of this. And in fact, the international, the cuts, like 10.4 million, malaria bed nets are being cut. Those cost almost nothing. So a lot of folks, Catholic bishops, National Association of Evangelicals, a lot of us across the spectrum are saying that the most effective and critical programs for the poorest among us is not what should be targeted here. They didn't cause this, and they shouldn't bear the burden.
As you say, everything should be on the table. We could start with the $200 million in the $200 billion that Senator from Oklahoma required the Congressional Budget Office and the General Accounting Office to come up with waste and duplication of spending. They came up with $200 billion in 38 federal programs that are waste and duplicates. For instance, the Department of Commerce. Now that they don't do the census anymore, I'm not sure what the Department of Commerce does. It spends $34 billion. I'm not sure what it does.
Yeah, let's agree that we're going to cut waste. The biggest waste, everyone will tell you, is in the military, the Pentagon. The biggest, most wasteful spending is military spending. So I want someone to say out loud, you can say it now, that every line item of military spending is more important than 10.4 million malaria bed nets.
Well,
I don't think we can say that.
I think there's no budget that's ever been conceived that can't take a 5% across the board cut. I guarantee you there's 5% waste in every program that the government is using. And we could start by a 5% cut, say, okay, we want every department of government to come up with 5% cuts in the next year. And I believe they could do so without any serious problem in delivery. Now, you talked about entitlements, Jim. We're going to have to talk about entitlements. And because the entitlements are at an unsustainable level. And the reason is we have one size fits all entitlements. And we can no longer afford those. We're going to have to find a way to, I don't know whether you want to call it means test or whether you want to call it taxing the benefits of those who are wealthier, but people who have other retirement that they've gotten through their companies or through IRAs, people who have other retirement income are going to have to get less from Social Security than the
we could agree.
And same thing with Medicare. We're going to have to, at the very least, say, okay, if you have a retirement income of a certain amount, then let's say every $10,000 that your income is above a certain amount, then you're going to have to pay an extra $500 for your Medicare. You're going to get that deducted as $500.
Entitlements.
We can't afford
entitlements should be on the table. I agree. Entitlements should be on the table. For example, the Social Security tax level is way too low. If we just raise that ceiling and tax more of the income of wealthy people, we could probably solve that issue. What I'm saying, I'm very narrowly focusing here. We have choices. For example, let me give you a choice. $8.5 billion in low-income housing is on the cutting block. $8.4 billion, same amount of money, is being kept for mortgage deductions on second vacation homes for the wealthy. That's a choice. That's a choice. What choice should we make there?
Well, I certainly would be against the second mortgage on vacation homes, obviously. But that's not...
Or $2.5 billion for home heating oil assistance for poor families during the wintertime, versus $2.5 billion for offshore drilling subsidies for oil companies making enormous hand over fist profits. That's a choice about how we spend our money. I'm saying, how should you make that choice? Oil companies don't deserve more subsidies. Agribusiness
they do deserve more right to
subsidies.
drill, though, Jim. They deserve more right to drill. We need to end the moratorium on drilling in the Gulf.
But in the budget,
one of the reasons
we're talking about the budget here.
Well, that's part of the budget. We're going to have to. We can't cut our way to balance. We're going to have to cut, but we're also going to have to do things that incentivize the growing the economy. When you grow the economy, you collect more taxes. When you don't grow the economy,
tax loopholes for the wealthiest people in the country, corporate jet subsidies, oil companies, these are making hand over fist profits already. I'm talking about preserving the WIC program for mothers and infants has been shown to save lives, save lots of lives. Mike Gerson, who worked for George Bush, talks about cuts that kill. If you cut vaccinations, cut malaria bed nets, those cuts will kill people. So we're talking about, this is the Catholic Bishops, National Association of Evangelical Salvation Army, all of us are saying, let's focus on the programs, a narrow set of programs that are effective, transparent, and those really help poor people survive. Everything else is on the table. Military, entitlements, I agree, but so should corporate loopholes be on the table as well. I don't think we owe subsidies to the rich people in the country while we're cutting survival for the poorest. I
agree, Jim, but we have to incentivize wealth creation. And let's understand that the top 5% of income earners, those making more than $159,000 a year, accounted for almost 60% of the nation's federal taxes, though they only make 35% of the income. There comes a point at which taxation becomes counterproductive to growing the economy, and we have to try to find that sweet spot. I'm not a flat taxer. I believe in a progressive tax system, but you can get to the point, as the British discovered prior to Mrs. Thatcher, when you stifle wealth creation, and instead of focusing on wealth creation, we focus on ever more equitably distributing, never growing pies. We need to have also if we're going to fix our budget problem, one of the ways we're going to have to fix it is to, unless we want enormous pain for the entire population, is to help grow an economy that produces more revenue. And then we can talk more about how we divide it. And so I'm saying that
tax cuts for hedge fund directors doesn't produce jobs. I mean, let's focus. I'm happy to incentivize those who are producing jobs. That's a good idea. Then the focus is on small business, but not, Goldman Sachs people are not creating a lot of jobs here, and they're making a fortune. The wealthy have the lowest tax rates right now than they've had since the 1950s.
That's not true, Jim. That's a false statement by the president. It's not true.
No, it's not. Warren Buffett says it well that he pays a lower portion of his tax than his secretary does. He's right. Tax rates are lower than they've ever been for the wealthy, and so let's incentivize jobs.
The wealthy pay a greater share of federal income taxes right now than they have since 1980, according to the Internal Revenue Service. That year, the top 1% paid 18% of all federal income taxes, and in 2008 they paid 38%. So you know what Mark Twain said about statistics, Jim. There are lies, blank lies, and statistics.
We'll let the fact checkers check. When I said the lowest tax rates they've had since the 1950s, I think that's true. So we can let the facts check it.
I'm saying terms of the amount of taxes,
the principle here is the wealthy.
You can check the amount of taxes they pay, and they'll discover that the top 1% paid 18% of all federal taxes in 1980. They paid 38% of all federal taxes that were paid in 2008. That's from the Internal Revenue Service. You can go to the Internal Revenue Service website and find it.
Are you saying we should cut taxes even more for the wealthy and do so
We should cut
by
taxes for
cutting
everyone.
back.
In a recession,
We're talking,
Jim, in a recession like ours, the one we're in right now, we shouldn't be raising taxes on anybody. We should be lowering taxes to the extent we can on everyone, because that's the way you.
So the corporate loopholes, right?
Pardon me?
So the corporate loopholes right now. Are you in favor of?
I'm not talking about corporate loopholes.
The benefits for corporate jets.
No, I'm talking about lowering the corporate tax rate. I'm not talking about loopholes. I'm talking about lowering the corporate tax rate. We have the second highest corporate tax rate in the world, exceeded only by Japan, which is also experiencing economic difficulty. Our corporate tax rate is 2.5 times what it is in China and Russia.
But as you know, those corporations don't pay that rate. We have corporations that paid no taxes last year.
Well, if they
no taxes at all.
I'm certain not
because of all the loopholes and all the ways they can get out. The corporate tax rate doesn't mean they pay those taxes, and you know that.
I'm not defending the current tax code. If the corporate tax rate were lower, they would spend less time trying to avoid tax and more time trying in wealth formation.
Okay, we're saying, and when I say we, I'm saying the broad swath of the faith community, evangelicals, Catholics, all of us are saying that the poorest and most vulnerable should not be made to hurt more than they're already hurting because of budget cutting and deficit reduction. And in fact, Simpson-Bowles had that principle. When we've done this before, we've used that principle. You used to have bipartisan support, that you don't cut the poorest people. Everything else should be on the table. Military spending, revenues, the tax code, entitlements, all of that should be on the table. I'm saying the poorest should not bear the brunt of deficit reproduction. It just isn't right. It's not biblically defensible to do that. When the wealthy get more and more support and the poor, I mean, you know, the only people who've gone back to normal in the recession are the people who helped to cause it. That Wall Street is doing great, but not Main Street. So we bail them out, we socialize their risk. But the rest of us have to live with free market capitalism. And that doesn't seem right to me.
Well, I'm certainly not defending the bailouts. If you're waiting for me to do that, you're going to be waiting a long time.
Yeah, but that's where our money went. That's where our money
a lot
has
of
gone.
it went. But that's not where not where the stimulus went. I'm trying to figure out where the stimulus went. It didn't go into creating jobs. But we've got to.
We're both for creating jobs. We're both for creating jobs. And I'm happy to incentivize job creation, but not just giving the wealthy more and more breaks so they don't all create jobs with that money.
No.
They buy, I mean, how many yachts can you ski behind?
I mean, you know, corporations do, small businesses do. Small businesses, of course, most of them aren't incorporated, so they pay at the individual tax rate. And, you know, Jim, you know, there are lots of parts of this country where $200,000 a year is not wealthy. If you live in New York City, $200,000 a year is not wealthy. It may be in Fargo, North Dakota, but in New York City, it's not. When the president starts talking about the rich at $200,000 or $250,000 for a family, that's an awful low standard to start penalizing people for wealth formation.
That's fine, but we both know the Goldman Sachs traders and hedge fund directors are not the ones who are creating jobs.
I'm not,
and they're getting all this tax benefit.
Jim, I'm not defending them, and you know they're the boogeyman that you're trying to use here, but that won't work. That's not where the problem is.
The boogeyman's real. 6 banks caused this crisis.
I'm aware of that,
and they got away with it.
I'm aware of that.
They are a boogeyman, and they caused it, and they're being rewarded, and they shouldn't be.
Well, the budget crisis that we face today is far more systemic and long-term than 6 banks. And you know it, and I know it. We have a baby boom generation that is getting ready to retire. The first baby boomer turned 65 January the 1st of this year. We know who she is. She's a school teacher from New Jersey, and she's retired and is living on a houseboat going up and down the Intercoastal Canal. And there are going to be 78 million baby boomers who are going to retire. And we cannot sustain dealing with all 78 million of those baby boomers the same way. The people who have other retirement resources are going to have to accept comparatively less in Medicare and in Social Security in order to keep those programs viable for the people who really need them and who depend upon them as their only source.
And I've already agreed that if we just make the taxable income higher on Social Security, which we could do, make the ceiling much higher, that would probably solve that crisis. I'm for the principle of means testing. What I'm talking about is let's not put the burden on the poorest and most vulnerable. The circle of protection agrees that entitlement reform is necessary. Military spending has to be cut. We need more revenues as well. We need a fairer tax code, We need all that. But the principle we're offering here, the given, which has been accepted in the past in a bipartisan way, is you don't penalize the poorest and most vulnerable and make them pay the highest burden. And many of the suggestions, Paul Ryan's suggestions, 2/3 of his deficit reduction comes from targeting poor people. That's just wrong, and we shouldn't do that. And we're meeting with the president, we're meeting with Republicans, the Speaker of the House, we're meeting across the board, because we politically are across the board. The people I talked about are across the board. We're saying protecting the poor must be a principle in deficit reduction. That's all we're saying. The rest, I agree with you. Put it on the table. All entitlements, military spending, revenues, fair tax code, but let's not beat up the poor in the name of budget cut.
Well, I certainly don't want to beat up the poor, but we are going to have to we're going to have to do some form of means testing. You know, people say, well, I've paid into these programs. Well, you and I both have paid into these programs, but I saw a figure the other day that under the current system, people who made a median income who retire in the next 10 years are scheduled to get back $348 for every dollar they put in to Medicare and Social Security. If they live out a normal lifespan. That's just, that you can't get that kind of return on investment. We're going to have to, I'll give you a personal example. My wife turned 65 in February. She had to register for Medicare. It was the law. Otherwise, she's penalized when she needs to collect it. Now, she's not taking Medicare. She's under my insurance, and she will be under my insurance probably for another 5 to 7 years. But what happens now is that when we file a claim with our insurance company then goes to Medicare to help pay the bill. Well, that kind of thing has got to stop. We just can't afford it.
Yeah, but again, we're probably agreeing, and I think we could, in the faith community, come together around some principles around entitlements. I think entitlement scrutiny has to happen. And I just said, raise the ceiling on what you tax for income on Social Security. That would help.
Well, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. Certainly, I wouldn't do it right now, because we don't need to raise taxes like that when we're in the middle of a recession. What I think we ought to do is instead say, when you retire, if you have other retirement income above a certain amount, we already do this. We tax a certain percentage of your Social Security benefits if you have an income above a certain level. We're going to need to increase that taxation at certain levels, and I think we also need to apply it to Medicare and say, let's say you're 70 years old and you retire and you go on Medicare, and you have invested well and you've got retirement income that is significant. Then perhaps for every $10,000 that you have in retirement income per year, you should pay $500 toward your Medicare premiums, so that we could reduce the burden on those on the government paying for those who don't have anything but Medicare and anything but Social Security.
Yeah. What I'm saying is entitlement reform that in fact protects the most vulnerable is exactly what we should do. What we're saying in the circle of protection right now in this debate going on is you can't continue to do the corporate welfare, corporate subsidies, agricultural subsidies, military spending without any kind of constraint. You can't have an unfair tax code. You can't keep giving the wealthy more and more and more and reduce the deficit on the backs of the poorest people. Deficits are moral issues. You and I agree. How we reduce deficit is also a moral issue. All we're saying in the circle of protection is we have to protect the poorest and most vulnerable. Where there are programs that need to be more efficient, transparent, a lot of us work with those programs. We want them to change. But you can't reduce the effort that we're spending now to help the poorest survive. And overseas, it's a really small amount of money. I mean, David Cameron in the UK, who's doing a lot of austerity, exempted his development spending from cuts because he says these cuts will kill. These programs keep people alive. And so overseas, that's true, and at home. Kids that get Pell Grants to go to college for the first time in their lives, first in their family, we don't want to cut that. We don't want to cut that future off. Women and children, WIC programs are proven successful. Head Start, very effective programs. Our churches work with these programs with the people. They're going to defund World Vision. They're going to defund Catholic Church. Programs that are faith-based that get some government help, like medical clinics in the west side of Chicago, are going to be cut. And we're saying protect the poor, protect the vulnerable, and make the wealthier pay their fair share.
Well, if you're talking about closing corporate jet loopholes, I have no problem with that. But if you get to the point of confiscatory taxation, you retard the formation of wealth, and that helps nobody. When you start taxing people at rates at which they no longer find it productive to work, they don't work. The example that I'll use is the one that I experienced when I lived in England prior to Mrs. Thatcher. We lived in a parsonage, and we couldn't get anyone to tune our piano in the parsonage. The piano was badly out of tune. My wife wanted to play it. I called every piano tuner in town. Nobody could do it for a year. So I waited till the piano tuner that tuned the church piano went down to the church and tuned the church piano, and I went down there with some hot chocolate and some cookies and suggested there might be more back at the house if he wanted to come back to the house. And
you're a persuasive guy, Richard.
And I asked him, I said, why is it that I can't get anybody to tune the piano? And he said, I make, and he gave me a figure of about $20,000 a year in pounds. And he said, everything I make above that, I've got to pay 90% of it to the government. So he said, all the piano tuners I know, we make our $20,000, and then we just don't work the rest of the year because we don't work for 10 cents on the dollar. People, there's a certain level, and there's a sweet spot beyond which people are not going to work productively for the benefit of everyone in society.
Yeah. Why don't we agree? Part of the circle of protection, one of our principles is that we're in favor of economic growth that creates jobs. That's in our statement of principles. We want that. We want that too. So why don't we focus on incentives that help economic growth and create jobs, and not just across the board tax cuts to all the rich, no matter what they do with that money. I mean, that's the waste. That's just subsidizing the rich. Why don't we focus on growth and job creation, which we all, both of us, want more jobs. The government can't dictate for low-income people.
We can't have it.
No, we can focus on small businesses that are creating jobs. We can incentivize job creation, not just if you
incentivize job creation by cutting tax rates, particularly corporate tax rates. And you can't. The government can't be. But the government is notoriously bad at picking winners and losers in economies. And Jim, I have to say this. In the last half century, the Chinese and the Indians have abolished geometric times the poverty since they both adopted capitalism than either one ever did under communism or socialism.
That's right, but be careful now, because those governments, as you know, were much more active than what you're talking about. They were very active in fact, that economic development. They were not just laissez-faire, stand back. They were very active.
But not command and control in terms of subsidizing certain industries, perhaps, yes. But
Singapore, China, they were very active.
The fact is that they abandoned communism in the case of China and the socialism that the Indians inherited from the British. And when they both did, they began to eliminate many times the poverty that they ever did under communism and socialism.
No one's calling for communism and socialism here. We're talking about a fair tax code. We're talking about not putting the burden on the poorest people. We're talking about in fact, incentivizing growth and jobs, all that. No one's talking about communism and socialism here. We're talking about fairness here. And right now, it is unfair. We are subsidizing. We do have socialism in America, socialism for Wall Street. We have safety nets for Bank of America. We want to cut safety nets for the poorest. That's wrong. Bank of America doesn't need safety nets, but the people in my neighborhood do. So let's talk about focusing on protecting the poor. And then you and I both agree, growth and jobs is what we want. And let's, in fact, reform entitlements in a way that makes them sustainable for the future. I'm all for that. All I want to do is protect the poorest who don't have any lobbyists speaking for their interests.
I want to solve the problem, and the problem is not going to be solved without growing the economy, number one, and number two, without addressing a one-size-fits-all entitlement program.
I agree.
That we can no longer afford.
Let's protect the poor on the way. Let's do both those things. Growth and not a one-size entitlement. I'll agree with both those things. But then let's protect the poorest along the way and make sure they don't bear the brunt of our deficit reduction.
And I think that it has to be said that when it comes to the military, that sometimes military decisions to cut cost lives too. I'm very concerned about the future of Afghanistan, and particularly about the women of Afghanistan. And if we cut too quickly and we cut too broadly in terms of our assistance to Afghanistan, those could be decisions that kill too, particularly women.
Well, you and I have disagreed before. I agree with Chuck Colson. The war in Afghanistan is no longer a just war. So we have unnecessary and unjust wars. I think that cost too much in lives. Walter Jones, a Republican in North Carolina, I was with him last week in Congress, member of Congress, and he believes now he was wrong to vote for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, and of course, Lieberman, who's a Democrat, agrees with me.
Fine. All right.
I'm not willing to abandon.
We can disagree.
I'm not willing to abandon the women of Afghanistan to the
Neither am I, nor do I think a war of occupation going on will protect them long term. So we can have that conversation. But if we can agree, I think we are finding some common ground here. We want economic growth and job creation, absolutely. We think the entitlements need to be reformed down the road, or they won't be able to sustain themselves. But let's protect the poor along the way and not put excessive burdens on them as we move toward what we both want, which is fiscal health and responsibility.
Well, we've got to have it. If we don't, we're going over a cliff. If we do not,
I want that too for my kids and grandkids.
If we don't put a stop to this runaway spending in the next 5 years, we will have crossed the Rubicon. And if we become Greece, there's nobody to bail us out.
And if we unfairly burden the poorest and most vulnerable in doing that, we will have sinned against them and against God in doing so.
Well, I certainly don't want to. We have got to, in a nation as wealthy as ours, we've got to take care of the most needy and the poor among us.
Agreed.
But we also need to, Jim, talk about some of the social dysfunctions that cause some of that poverty.
Absolutely, and you and I both agree on that. And I don't want to punish the kids for the mistakes and sins of their parents.
I think we need to do things like the Bush program to try to promote marriage. Why would anyone be against the government having programs that promote marriage in the underclass?
When we had the debate on welfare reform, I was one of the few people that was supportive of the promotion of marriage programs and money for child care. Liberals, conservatives, they divided over that. I was for both because I want to promote marriage and I want to support the kids. So I think you ought to join the circle of protection. I think you'd like it. I'll send you all the stuff.
All right, and let's be very careful that we do not do anything in government programs that retards entrepreneurs who want to start businesses, who want to expand businesses, and who are not incentivized to do so when they don't get a large enough return on their investment.
And let's also not socialize the risks of the wealthiest and just keep giving them subsidies they don't need and that does nothing to help the rest of the country.
Well, you're looking at a guy who was against the bailout, so.
All right, my friend. Great talking with you as always.
You too. Be sure to tell your wife hello for me.
And you, same back to you. Thank you.